Thanks very much, Steve. So today I'd just like to talk about and bring you up to date on the results of our mass marking studies in Lake Ontario. In 2008, the New York State DEC purchased an automated mass marking trailer. It's a system that automatically marks and tags Chinook salmon and other salmon and trout at a high rate of speed and accuracy. So it's enabled us to conduct studies that were previously not feasible. And just like to start off first by acknowledging my co-authors from the New York State DEC, Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, and also the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. New York stocks 2.3 million Chinook salmon per year in Lake Ontario, but we know that there's a fair amount of wild reproduction as well. One study in the Salmon River in New York, which is one of our major tributaries in Lake Ontario, Everett estimated that about 4 to 6 million Chinook wild par were produced at the Salmon River in 2005. And then in Ontario, we also know that the tribs produce wild Chinook. Jim Bowlby has some data to show that wild fish are also produced there, but there's an unknown contribution to the fishery. The graph on the right there on the bottom is a seining index that Dan Bishop conducts every year, in which he tracks the production on the Salmon River. As you can see, there's a fair amount of variability. And despite knowing that fish are being produced in these tributaries, there really wasn't any information to tell us whether those fish were actually surviving and contributing to the Lake Ontario fishery, which is important information for fisheries managers when considering stocking decisions. So all Chinook salmon stocked by New York and Ontario from 2008 to 2011 were marked with an adipose fin clip, and then sampling has been conducted from 2009 until 2015. So this is what we found. So most of all of the year classes now have been recruited to the fishery. In 2015, those 2011 fish that were stocked then are now 4 years old, so they're out of the population. And the majority of our fish that are caught in the fishery are age 2 and 3, and this just gives you the data on those fish for each of the year classes. You can see there's a fair amount of variability from 36% up to 70% of those fish were wild in the lake, so a fair amount. But overall, wild Chinook made up an average of 48% of the age 2-3 Lake Ontario harvest from 2010 to 2014, so a significant component of the lake fishery. We also have some information on tributaries. We conducted sampling in tributaries as the fish returned to spawn, and wild Chinook were also an important part of the tributary fishery there, but this varied by location. In the west region of New York, an average of 7% of the fish returning to those tributaries were wild. In the east region, an average of 15% of the fish returning to those tributaries were wild. At the Salmon River, however, if you remember, that's one of our largest tributaries, and that's where the seining index is conducted, and it suggests that there's a lot of wild par being produced. An average of 50% of those fish returning to that tributary were wild. So that's actually a huge, very important fishery to New York as well. There's a lot of angling that goes on. If you haven't been there in the fall, it's a bit of a madhouse. There's something like 600,000 angler hours on that tributary alone. So it's an important part of the fishery, and the wild fish are contributing to that as well. A little bit less information on the Canadian side, but at the Credit River, an average 11% were wild returning to that tributary. And then in 2013, there was some sampling conducted, and 99% of those fish returning to that tributary at Bowmanville Creek were wild. So it varies, the production potential varies across the lake, but I'd say in general the Salmon River is probably our largest producer, but then all of those little tributaries along the north shore of Ontario are also contributing probably about as much as New York tributaries and the Salmon River combined when you do the napkin math, as Andy calls it. So our second study was to determine the degree of homing and straying to broodstock sites. Each year, the fish are collected at 2 broodstock sites, one in New York and one in Ontario. In New York State, fish run the Salmon River, and then they enter the Salmon River hatchery. So the question for managers was whether those fish that are being stocked at all the red dots, all those stocking sites are straying back to the place where they're raised at the Salmon River or at the Salmon River, or whether those fish are imprinting to those sites. So all Chinook salmon stocked at Salmon River and Credit River from 2008 to 2010 were clipped and tagged. And at Salmon River, straying of fish from other sites varied with year class and age, but generally straying was low, averaging about 10%. So apparently the methods that we're using to stock fish, by stocking those fish at a particular size at each of those stocking sites along the lake, is working to imprint those fish to those stocking sites, and the straying was low back to the Salmon River. Another interesting result was that although we see that large numbers of wild fish returning to the Salmon River, very few of those fish seem to be straying into the hatchery. The wild fish are straying into the hatchery. A low proportion of wild Chinook enter the hatchery, average about 8.5% over those years. In Ontario, we do have some data at the Credit River. This is a little different situation. The Ontario takes their fish at the Credit River when they're returning to spawn, but they actually raise them at Normandale Hatchery now, right, Andy? And then stock those at various sites. But still, the question remains: were those fish that they're stocking at the Credit River imprinting back to that stocking site? Which also is an important fishery for Ontario. And what we found is that majority of those fish returned to the Credit River were stocked at the river. So apparently their stocking methods are working as well for imprinting. And in fact, the majority of tag strays were from Bronte Creek, which is a nearby tributary. The third study was to compare the relative survival of imprinting of pen versus direct stock Chinook salmon. So in the late 90s, the department and some local angler groups started putting fish into pens. And the idea behind the pens is to try to increase imprinting to those sites. There was a belief before we had this marking data that because we're stocking those fish at those sites, but all the fish are raised at the hatchery, that those fish were actually straying back to the hatchery. So the idea behind the pens were to try to increase imprinting to those sites by bringing the fish at a smaller size, raising them for about 3 weeks, and then releasing them at those stocking sites. So, the other thing I wanted to tell you that there's about 10 sites in Ontario currently and 8 in New York. So mass marking was conducted to compare pen versus direct. The fish were clipped and tagged from 2010 to 2011, and then again in 2013. We skipped 2012 because it was a warm year. So at eight New York sites, each site and method received an individual unique coated wire tag, and they were stocked at a 1-to-1 ratio. And then sampling occurred from 2012 through 2015. It's still ongoing. That last 2013 year class will leave the lake BH4 in 2017. But next year we're pretty much wrapping the study up. These are results from 2 years so far. And what we found is that pen fish provide 2-to-1 better return than direct stock fish to the lake. So they're surviving better to the lake. These are each of the individual sites, and the averages are on the bottom. We also looked at the relative survival of Chinook stock at the Salmon River. Those fish are held a little longer at the Salmon River hatchery to try to increase that imprinting, and they're actually held until they reach smolt size. So they're released at a stocking size of about 8.2 grams versus 4.6 grams in our direct stocking. So we had 1 year, that 2010 year class, in which we had overlap of our tagging, where we could look at and compare the return of the Salmon River fish versus the direct stock fish. And what we found is that the Salmon River fish actually perform about as well as the pen fish, about a 2-to-1 ratio versus the direct stock fish. Also looked at a few other questions. Is there a difference in size and age between pen versus direct? And what we found is that only at age 2 we found a significant difference of about 1.5 inches. Whether there's a biological significance to that or not is really unclear. So now we have a lot of tag data out there, and an interest of ours is to sort of know where, when we stock these fish, where are they being caught? And so what we've done recently is take a sample of 825 tagged Chinook salmon. We have thousands of tags, but we just took a sample of 800 just to look at the distribution and movement of these stocked fish. So the fish around the lake there and the different colors represent the fish that are being stocked at each of those sites. And you'll see as I make this happen here that this is where these fish are being caught. You can see the New York fish are moving a little slower than the Ontario fish. I'm not sure what that represents. I want to thank Andy for putting this together. What this tells us is that these fish are moving all over the lake, and it's just a big melting pot. You know, these fish are used to swimming in the Pacific Northwest and much larger water bodies, so perhaps Lake Ontario is just a bathtub for them. But they are moving all over the lake and contributing to everybody's fishery. However, when you look, those samples were from April through July, which would include fish before they start to stage and start to go back to their home stream. So when you include September samples, what we find is that 40% of or August and September samples, sorry, what we find is that 40% of the fish harvested at sites were stocked at the site. 40% of the fish caught at that site were stocked in the same region as the site, and then 20% of the fish harvested at sites were stocked in the other region. So what this tells us is that the fish are actually staging and then contributing to the fishery, and in fact, about 60% of our fishery occurs in that August and September period versus the earlier part of the year. So do stock Chinook imprint to sites, and what we're finding is when we sample in these tributaries, that yes, the majority of those stock fish returning to the tributaries were stocked at the site. Greater than 80% at all the sites of those fish returning to the tributary were stocked at the site. And most of the fish that are straying to those sites are coming from nearby locations. But the next question is, do pen stock Chinook imprint to streams better than direct stock Chinook? So if you remember, the principal purpose behind the pens were to try to increase imprinting. Well, what we find is that they're actually increasing survival. When we adjust for that increased survival in the lake, and then compare the numbers between pen and direct stocked Chinook returning to the tributaries, what we find is that really there's no difference in the imprinting of the pen versus direct stocked fish. But if you remember my previous slide, it really shows us that imprinting is not a problem anyway, and that the methods that the hatcheries are using, getting those fish out to those sites at a proper size, is leading to good imprinting at those sites. So just to summarize, wild Chinook are important to the fishery, average about 48% of the age 2 and age 3 fish in the lake. A low proportion of Chinook stray from stocking sites to the Salmon River hatchery, and also straying to the Credit River was low. Chinook imprint well. Most stocked Chinook that return to tributaries are stocked at those tributaries. Now, spawning Chinook stray, but that straying rate is low, and it's mostly to other nearby sites. Pen fish provide a 2-to-1 return, as well as the Salmon River stocking provided about a 2-to-1 return compared to direct stock fish, based on 2010 and 2011 stockings. We have that 2013 stocking results pending. But these results are important for making stocking decisions for our managers. The 2-to-1 survival of pen versus direct, and also the wild component, are very important for consideration when you're making those stocking decisions. Our next study is to evaluate returns of coho salmon fall fingerling versus spring yearling stocking. We also use the mass marketing trailer to conduct lake trout tagging and clipping every year. So I just want to make the point, though, that this has been there's a wider Great Lakes mass marketing initiative which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is leading, and this has really provided us a great deal of great information for making management decisions. And that's it.